Oh, there I am. All right. Don't get excited. We ain't starting yet. We're just getting the mic turned on. All right, about time to get started. We skipped a couple verses from last week. Last week we finished up Mark chapter 11. If you jump ahead a couple verses, we'll be in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. So, did a little jump. Not too bad. Page or two. It is Green Valley. So, for those of you who don't know what that is, we give cash to the Green Valley Bible Camp every first Sunday of the month, and they use that money for the kids for church camp up there at Green Valley and Rogers. And we even have alumni with us that would agree that it's a worthy effort and a worthy cause, and your money goes to a good cause. So,
John,
yes, sir.
for us to take the money up for Mike now.
Who we give that to?
Mike.
We give it to Wayne? For Mike. We give it to Wayne for Mike? Okay. And I don't know if he's watching this morning. If he is, don't listen. Yeah.
Hear me anyway.
Yeah. So, see Wayne regarding that last announcement. If you have any questions, see Wayne about what the announcement was, and he'll help you out there. So, yes.
Anyone drive a Jeep? Yellow Jeep?
Like, all right. So we're going to be in 2 Corinthians this session, this quarter, this bit, and we kind of skipped past 2 Corinthians, and And because when we look at it, what we see is the purpose of the book is Paul just defending his apostleship. So we all agree he's an apostle, so we just kind of move on past that and move to something else. And so I thought we would look at it in just a little bit different perspective through this quarter, and we pay attention basically to those two sections in chapters 8 and 9 where it talks about being a cheerful giver. Now, we don't dwell on that particular section, but we know that section. And then the section towards the end where it talks about Paul's thorn in the flesh, and we like to argue about that. I don't know that we're focusing on that much, but there's a lot of argument, discussion, pleasant discussion about that, and we'll get to that when we get to the end of 2 Corinthians. But those are the two basic sections that we know from 2 Corinthians better than the others, and we kind of go over the other side, but we don't really study the book. So he's got a lot more to teach us about how to give, or than just how to give and how to suffer, as far as the teaching of the book goes. And it's easy to focus on, it's Paul's suffering, and it's easy to focus on that as far as just the suffering in and of itself and God's comfort to Paul. But we're going to talk a lot more about that. But Paul just opens himself up during 2 Corinthians, talks about his life, talks about how he wishes to build up the faith in the Corinthians, and even if we ever manage to get to the end of the book, towards the end of the book, in chapter 12, Paul explains a little bit of that. And he says, "Have you been thinking all along that we've been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we've been speaking in Christ, and for all your upbuilding, beloved. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and you may find me not as you wish. That perhaps there be quarreling and jealousy and anger and hostility and slander and gossip and conceit and disorder, all these sinful things." And so Paul is explaining, as he's writing about himself and Timothy and Apollos, they're not defending themselves, though, just primarily defending themselves, but they do defend themselves, but there's a purpose behind that. There's a reasoning in the teachings of Paul, and he'll bring that forth as we go through the lesson. But he wants the Christians to be built up and not be found when he comes, mired in these sinful things, the whole list of sinful things that he was talking about. And so those types of behaviors. And so he's using himself to show the Corinthians what love really looks like. And we're going to kind of look at it through a different perspective, as far as we'll see it's far more than just merely defense of Paul as far as the letter goes. We're going to find God's purpose through the Apostle Paul is to encourage, to build up, and to move us away from sins that will ruin us, okay? And so as we look into Paul's reasoning, we understand that everyone needs encouragement. Everyone needs strength. And this is especially when we're suffering, okay? If you're suffering, it's especially not necessary, it's especially helpful, it's especially welcome, it's especially needed when we're suffering. And so Paul says, and we all have a picture in our mind, and I say that because I have pictures in my mind, and I realize that there's people in the world that do not have an internal monologue. And so I'm just going to say I have a picture in my mind, and I think we all do have an idea of what comfort means to us, okay? We have comfort food. We have comfortable clothes. We have comfortable bed and comfortable atmosphere and comfortable whatever that may be. We have an idea of what comfort is. It's something that's given to us or we take or we use for that reason. And so Paul talks about comfort in verses 3 through 7. He talks about it 5 times, and so, or 10 times in those 5 verses. Because we need comfort for all that we go through in life and the difficulties and afflictions we face. So our description of our God in verse 3 is, He's the Father of mercies and God of all comfort. The God of all comfort, and He comforts us in our afflictions, okay? We don't use that word much. I don't use that word much. I don't know that I've ever used that word as much as I did this week as I was studying in my mind. Afflictions is just not something we use, but what he's talking about, it's this affliction, depending on what version you read. It could be troubles, tribulation, and literally spoken, it's pressure, compression, or distress, something that's just on us. You know, you've heard the weight of the world on your shoulders and that kind of thing, and that's what this affliction is talking about. And so it's trials or tribulations or pressure. It's just the stuff that we go through. And so as we read through, when we say afflictions, we're going to think pressure and trial and distress and trouble in our life as far as what the definition of that is. And so, and if you notice what Paul says, God comforts us in all of our afflictions. And so your pressure may be way different than my pressure, which may be way different than your neighbor's pressure, but all afflictions, all of those afflictions, God is our comfort. But I want us to see that God comforts us in our afflictions, okay? Not from our afflictions. I want us to hear that. God comforts us in our afflictions, not from our afflictions. And we're going to talk more about that and different levels of that and things that, you know, afflictions that are taken away and afflictions that are not, and you just get through. And so when comfort is not the removal of the sufferings, okay? When I think of what would comfort me most in my trials and sufferings, I need to take that away, you know. If it's too cold, make it warm. If it's too hot, make it cold. You know, take that away. Don't allow me to acclimate. Okay, and I think that's what part of what God's plan for our lives is allowing us to acclimate to that pressure in order to see God in that comfort. And so it's not so taking the pressure away is not the picture that's given to us here. He brings us comfort in our distress. He brings us comfort in our difficulty. And so escaping that difficulty is not necessarily the goal, okay? Because in that affirmity or in that trial or in that pressure, as a Christian, we're actually being built up. We're actually being strengthened because of that. and it's, you can look at from an athlete's point of view as far as weightlifting. There's a lot of pain involved in weightlifting. And the easiest way to eliminate that pain, don't lift the weights, okay? But then if you don't have that pain and that, you don't get to where you're going. And so the pain is part of the process to get to where you're going. And so God brings us comfort in our distresses and difficulties. And so the recognition of God's comfort in the midst of our suffering is what we look forward to, okay? We like to know, and we do know, it's more difficult in the midst of suffering, but we do know in our suffering that God is there and God provides comfort. And it's just one of those things that we know or we should know, and it's kind of what Paul is talking about. So, but how do we receive that comfort from God? Okay, we could talk about the promises of God and the faithfulness of God, that He provides us comfort, and we know that, we know that. But and Paul will talk about that later. But there's another place that we find comfort from God. And this is kind of, we've been applying this concept to our yearly, I don't know if that's a goal or if it's a mantra or if it's just our focus. But we comfort others with the comfort that we receive from God, okay? And so we're blessed to bless, We comfort with the comfort that God shares with us. And so we comfort with that comfort that we receive from God. And so we need to look at that as God's comfort doesn't end with me. When God comforts me, that's not where it ends. And that's basically just where it begins, okay? God has given me this gift of comfort to share with others that need that gift of comfort, that share with others that gift of comfort, that share with others that gift of comfort. It's just perpetual, or circular, or whatever way you want to say it. And so being relieved of the discomfort is not necessarily the goal. Now, obviously, it could be our goal at the moment, in that time, but it's, we comfort others through their pressures and suffering. So we view ourselves as a conduit of God's comfort to others, okay? We're just passing that on. Now and this just happened to me, and I didn't realize I was doing it. And the more I thought about it, the more I have done it. And I think we all do it, and I don't know why. But I have even thought back on times I've seen it on TV and stuff like that. And and I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to tell you what it is. I want to get this disclaimer out first. So we view ourselves as a conduit to God's comfort, but we, as humans in our society, we like to play the comparison game, okay, in suffering. Rather than being a conduit of comfort, we like to compare, Someone says they're struggling and suffering, and what we do is tell that person how bad we've got it, okay? So we're going to one-up them on the suffering, okay? So, if you've had your knee scoped, well, I know that's terrible because I've had both of my knees scoped, okay? And so it's just we do that, and I don't know where that comes from, and we do that because we think it's comforting for someone else to know that we've suffered more than they have, And I think that's the opposite of the point of what we're talking about. I did this, a similar thing, just last week. And I have witnesses in this room that saw me do it. I just want to justify my actions by saying that I was trying to be a comfort. And that's what I'm going to say. Because a friend of mine had had an embarrassing incident, and I commenced to tell my most embarrassing story, to one-up this embarrassing thing. I wasn't trying to one-up. I was just trying to assure my friend that we all have those incidents. And so this thing just crushed me when I saw that. I thought, I just did that. I just did that. And I'm not supposed to do that, but I just did that. And so we play that comparison game, and we proceed to tell them that their suffering is nothing compared to mine, because mine's so much worse. And this is not what's meant by being a conduit of comfort. Suffering is not a competition. Okay? Our suffering has been given a purpose by God. Okay? I walked out of my apartment, I slipped on the stoop, and I bounced down the stairs, carrying 2 handfuls of trash. Thought never crossed my mind that I was hurt. That was the farthest thing from my mind. What was on my mind was, did anybody see that happen? Because that's mortifying. And so that's where I was as far as my story. And that's the Cliff Notes. Anyhow, so that. Way better than your worst embarrassing moment, I can tell you. So, but suffering is not a competition. We're given this purpose by God. And so, in another time, and just so we know it's just not me, everybody knows who David Letterman is. I would assume that everybody knows who David Letterman is. And he had heart issues. And part of his shtick after his heart issues he would have a guest come on, and they would have had 3 bypasses. I've had 5 bypasses, And so it's not just me, it's cultural, and that's how we do it. But as we look at verse 4 again, God comforts us in our affliction so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. So one of the purposes of our trials, one of the purposes of our afflictions or our pressure or our thing is to comfort others, okay? Now, we don't have to go through the same suffering. It doesn't have to be, you had one knee done, I had both knees done, that kind of, it doesn't have to be the exact same thing. We just need to show our brothers and sisters that God is the God of comfort. Okay, God will be a comfort, and that comes in many, it can come in many ways and shapes and forms. But one of our purposes in trials is to comfort others. We understand how to be compassionate for each other, and we should be compassionate to each other, rather than comparing or trying to one-up.
John, I think sometimes we forget that after you say, I've had both knees done, so I know you can get through this.
Right, exactly. That's the part, yeah, and that's kind of what, that's that tightrope you walk about trying to explain why you know what they're going through without trying to one-up them. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. We fail to articulate what we really want to say. So to be compassionate for each other rather than comparing our sufferings one to another. And also, we're not to wallow in the mire of self-pity and attention-seeking, but use our suffering, our afflictions, to comfort others. So what Jim was talking about, your example or our example in suffering brings comfort to others that are suffering based on the way we respond to that suffering. Now remember that. That's what Paul is talking about here. How we respond is very important as far as being a conduit of comfort to someone else. Okay? If we, and I happen to be one of them. I try not to be, but when I'm sick, I'm just going to say sick. When I'm ill, I'm not nice. I'm not nice at all. And so I would rather not be around people when I'm either in extreme pain or not feeling well or something like that. So they don't get a glimpse of the real me. I want to hide that part of me. But I do want to be an encouragement as I recover, so others will see that yes, you can get over whatever it is without all the other stuff that they don't get to see. So all through the letter, Paul talks about the good that the afflictions have been to him. Okay, now there are some that use that to talk about, well, Paul wasn't an apostle, because if Paul would have been an apostle, all of those sufferings wouldn't have been present in his ministry or in his life. And I'll just my opinion of that is that's just ridiculous. And so if he were truly an apostle, he wouldn't experience that much trouble. But Paul talks about that, and he says that he has troubles and is comforted by God so that, okay, the reason for his suffering and his receiving comfort from God is to comfort others, okay? And so as he comforts these Corinthians in their troubles and their trials, and that's a difficult thing to see in the midst of suffering. But then again, it takes practice, and the only way to get practice is to get that, to come out the other side of that suffering. So the point that Paul is trying to make is what God has done for him, God will do for them. Okay? So they can see what Paul has gone through. They know what Paul has gone through. They've heard of what Paul has gone through. And Paul is telling them that they serve the same God, and God will do for them what he's done for him. And so no matter the degree of the affliction, God will match the affliction with the comfort that we need. Okay? He won't necessarily match the comfort for the affliction that we think we need. Okay? But what we actually do need, that he knows we need. And Paul and Timothy, they suffer for righteousness' sake. They share in that suffering for Christ. And they saw their comfort as knowing that they were sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Okay? Saying Paul's not an apostle because he suffered is like saying Jesus wasn't the Christ because he suffered. And Paul understands the seed of his suffering is in his walk with Christ. He knows where that suffering is coming from. Okay? And so he also knows where the comfort's coming from. So there's nothing unusual about suffering. Okay? We all experience it, but we have to come to the same resolve or determine. We have to be determined to not allow the suffering to push us away from God, but we need to allow the suffering to draw us near to God with acceptance and joy for his comfort. And so suffering comes when you follow Christ. Okay, it just does. It comes with the territory. Now here, not near as much as it does in a lot of the even the places that we support. The suffering because of Christ is real, and it's intense, and it's not something that I think I could grasp. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, there's really a lot of different kinds of suffering. I think what you're referring to would be a lot different from like the suffering of a child dying of cancer. You know, you can understand how some suffering would be beneficial, but other suffering is very difficult to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the thing. And what Brian said is different types of suffering are harder to understand, harder to get a grasp of than the sufferings that we go through. Okay, and you know, in line with what Brian was saying, and I've told this story many times, and Dale and Sue know exactly who I'm talking about, but when my oldest son was born, they didn't think he was going to live. Okay, and this just sprung up on us, just boom. And we were in Little Rock, and it's a whole story, and if you ever want to hear the story, I'll tell you, but he had fluid on his brain and pressure and had to have emergency surgery as an infant, and they thought he was going to die at birth. They thought they were going to die in the emergency room or the operating room. They thought he was going to die on the helicopter ride. They thought he didn't have a chance, you know, just didn't have a chance. And so, that being said, how do I understand that as a father, that I can't fix that, you know, I can't fix that. All I can do is have faith in God that there's a reason that has happened. There's a reason that we were blessed with that child because we had the ability to deal with it. We had the ability to deal with that, okay? And I say all that, not having anything to do with me, but on in life, I had a good friend, and his daughter was diagnosed with the same exact condition as what my son. And my friend knew of what we had gone through. And so I was able to, I hope, and I think I was, because he has relayed that to me at a different point, be a comfort to him, because what I had gone through, and my son being an example to what his daughter could achieve having that same condition. So I see what you're saying, Brian. It's a tough thing. But, you know, I have I've been blessed with the time that I saw that suffering comforted someone else. And so, there are tough things that we will never understand, but there are times, like in my case, that I get to see, I guess, God's reasoning, or I get to see that God has blessed me in a way that I don't understand, that I'm actually being blessed. And so, we get to understand the power of God as Christians, not through the absence of suffering. Okay, that's not one of the things we should look for. Okay, we shouldn't say that, well, I'm a Christian, I'll never suffer because God. And that's not the way it works. Okay, not through the absence of suffering, but through that pain of suffering. That's just what God says. It's God's truth. We grow in Christ, we grow in faith through the suffering, not by avoiding the suffering, okay? We get to this point because of the pain from here to there. And so, along with that, others get to see our growth. And so, as we look into one of the points Paul is, not necessarily a point, but one of the examples that Paul is bringing to the Corinthians for their learning, for their understanding of what he's talking about, Paul's just not telling us about his problems. He wants us to learn, and he wants us to learn to endure, and he wants us to learn to accept God's comfort through Paul's experience with this particular thing. So this is what Paul says. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. We felt we had received the sentence of death. Okay? Paul is suffering to the point that he thinks that he can't go anymore. This is it. This is the end. This is where it stops. This is where it ends. He didn't see any way out of the circumstance he was in. And, we see Paul as a hero, as a Bible hero, as this huge example that we try to put up on a pedestal and try to emulate and try to be like or have the attitude of or try to act like Paul, like he's this superhuman, never had any issues, and we understand that that's not the case. He says he despaired of life and thought they were doomed. So what was his comfort? How did Paul endure and find comfort even though he was burdened to death, beyond his own strength, beyond anything he could imagine could help? And then he gives the reason. Okay? He gives the reason for his suffering to the point of death. It was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, on the God who raises the dead. Okay? So, Paul's reliance on God was strengthened by that issue. He saw the purpose in his suffering. The suffering caused him to rely on God and not on himself. And that's a lesson we all need. That's a lesson we can all take something from, because in trials we should get rid of dependence on ourselves, which is a difficult thing to do, and rely on God. Suffering and trials are to produce in us a recognition that there's no value in depending on ourselves, okay? And that's in stark contrast to what we're raised like, even as kids, as boys. I don't know girls. I don't know. That's a mystery. That's one of God's mysteries, and we're just going to leave it at that. He knows. But depending on ourselves is not the answer. Depending on God is what we learn. This is the God that raises the dead so he can deliver us. Now, boys are told to walk it off. Suck it up. Not helping, do it yourself. You learn to do things yourself. Be self-sufficient. Don't depend on anybody else. You'll just be disappointed. You've got to do everything for yourself with no help. You can't ask. Those are the kind of things. That's how I was. That's how I was raised, and I'm sure at some point along the line that's the way I raised my boys. I don't remember. You'll have to ask them. But yeah, that's how I raised them. And so that's why they have a mama to smooth out daddy's rough edges. And so God, the God that raises the dead, can deliver them. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. Now that's in stark contrast to what we learned in Mark when, Jesus fed the crowds, and then right around the corner the next time, what are we going to do? Okay? This is something, this is something we can learn from. The disciples didn't learn. Paul is staking his faith on this, that, God can. God can. Okay? If God can raise the dead, why am I worried about dying? If God wants me alive and I die, God can raise the dead. And that's the point that Paul is trying to make. His reliance on God and not on himself. Okay? And that's what trials do. They produce in us a recognition that there's no value in depending on ourselves. We have to depend on God. Okay? Paul sets his hope on God to deliver him, because he delivered him before, he'll deliver him again. Even when they were in utter despair, God is the God of deliverance. He delivered Christ. He raised him from the dead. He delivered Paul through his deadly peril. Paul is just trying to encourage the Corinthian brethren that God is able. God is there, and God is able. Now, sometimes God comforts us by delivering us out of that particular affliction. There are those cases. And sometimes he doesn't. But if we look back in 1 Corinthians, no testing is overtaking you that's not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he won't let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he also provides a way so that you'll be able to endure that testing. So then, at the end of the 2 Corinthians, he talks about his thorn in the flesh and the effect that it had on his life. And so we can see that God can remove the affliction, but he doesn't necessarily always do that. Okay? It's not always in his best interest. And so this is what Paul told us. God's comfort is not intended to make us comfortable. And that just seems counterintuitive, but it's to make us comforters. Okay? Not to make us comfortable, to make us comforters, so that we can pass that on. If God has comforted us in any measure, then we're basically commissioned by God to pass that comfort on, pass that experience on, not in a one-uppance, but just pass the experience on, that we might be a comforter to others. Okay?
That's where you've got to be real careful not to just say, well, I've had this.
Yes, exactly right.
I know you can get through it. And those few extra words sometimes makes all the difference.
They do, and they can change the whole dynamic of the conversation. And we do that a lot. How can we use our suffering but not think about ourselves, but how we can use our pain, our circumstances, to help others? And I would say that even that focus helps with our comfort, okay?
It's like he says he won't test us with more than we're able to endure. He wants to be by that most.
Right. I don't want to get to that edge. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
That's just the way we perceive it.
Yeah. And so, what can we do with those that are suffering? Well, prayer is one of our biggest tools in that particular arsenal. Pray for each other. Talk to God about how he'll comfort those that are suffering and how we can help those that are suffering. We talk about that a lot, what can I do to help? And it's not necessarily what, and I ran into that this weekend, but it's not necessarily what you want to do, okay? So I want to leave us with this. God is the God of all comforts, and he comforts us in our afflictions, and we want to comfort those who are in affliction with that comfort, okay? And that, in turn, comforts ourselves. But when we ask, what can we do? Okay? What can I do? We need to be willing to accept the answer. Okay? If I'm asking something, and this is the instance I'm talking about, and then we'll stop with that, but we need to be willing to do what it takes for the person that we're trying to comfort. I had a friend that's son passed away. I think he's in his 20s or something. Anyway, and another one of my friends was friends with the boy that passed away. So he called Jeff and says, "What can I do?" Okay? What can I do? Be careful, because Jeff had an answer. Okay? Jeff said, "Well, he had these 2 dogs." And then he's like, "Oh no, what have I done? What have I done?" And he was willing to step up, and he took the dogs, because that's what it took to what can I do. That was the what can I do. We need to be willing to do what can we do. Okay. I appreciate your time. Next week we'll still be in 2 Corinthians unless we move on to something else. Who knows? I appreciate you, Mike. You're always.